brings me great pleasure to introduce Patrick Anderson, and we are here today to talk about his books, The Lamentations, A Requiem for Queer Suicide, and Patricia Ybarra will be the interviewee. So I will turn it over to you two to get us started. Thank you both.
Great. And Patrick, you're going to just start by speaking eloquently, correct?
We'll see. Speaking at least. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Patrick Anderson. I'm a professor and currently, unfortunately, chair of the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. I've been here about 20 years. It only feels like forever. And I'm jointly appointed in ethnic studies and also critical gender studies here on our campus. And so when Tony, thank you for this invitation, by the way. The way that Tony sort of suggested that Patty and I set this up is that I would start just by talking for a few minutes about the book, and then Patty might frame a few questions, and then open things up and moderate, a discussion with other folks. So if that's all right, that's, I guess, how we'll start. And so here we go. So The Lamentations, A Requiem for Queer Suicide, which Tony showed you a minute ago. I don't know, I'm still showing myself way down in the little box. So, oh, that's different. But maybe I hope folks can see me. This is a book that I did not expect to write. In fact, it's a book I didn't realize I was writing until it was almost written. The story of the book is that shortly before the COVID pandemic, so in mid 2019, my best friend of decades suddenly died and died by suicide. And this death was the fourth queer suicide in my very close circle. And like most queer and trans folks, there were lots of other folks who had died in that way in my broader circle, so in my broader communities. The first such death for me was my grandfather, who died before I was born. And so for much of my early life and adolescence, and now my adult life, I heard my father telling stories about this death many, many times. He had narrated the story so many times that it had become, almost like a theatrical monologue. And I say that in the most generous way. He and his twin sister, who were 16 at the time, were home alone with their father, and my father is the one who found him. So it was an intense story, and like many Southerners, he had converted it into, a narrative that could be recited and performed over and over. And so some of my earliest memories as a child are hearing him tell the story again and again. The other two of the four were two of my oldest queer friends who I knew when I was sent to a school in Birmingham, Alabama, a boarding school that quite literally saved my life in the 1980s. So a very hostile place in general, a very hostile time for queer people. It was this school that was, a lifesaver, but was simultaneously a context from which these two old friends of mine, shortly after I graduated from school, took their own lives. In any case, back to 2019. And so I, was with a few other of this friend's closest circle, put in charge of writing his obituary and planning the memorial and dealing with, all of his stuff in Oakland, so up in Northern California. And it took us a long time to plan what we thought would be an appropriate memorial service for such a vivacious and huge person. And so it wasn't until fall of 2019 that we actually had the party, more or less, in a park in the Oakland Hills. And then shortly after that, everything shut down. And I noticed today, because I did something I rarely do, which is to look at Facebook this morning, and saw that it is, one of these memories pops up. And today is the anniversary of when I received the first COVID vaccine back in 2021. And from that point backwards, it had been a full year since I had touched another human being. I live alone and for various reasons took the lockdown very seriously because of vulnerabilities. And so, narrating this at this point sounds, this kind of narrative might have sounded melodramatic or overly romantic or baroque, a narration of mourning or a series of unfortunate events. But at this point, it almost sounds banal because so many folks, I think, experienced profound isolation. And for queer and trans folks, a close proximity to a previous pandemic, ongoing pandemic, but the first wave of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. So it was a very odd time because for the first few months after this friend's death, I was able to structure my grief around writing his obituary, planning the memorial service, distributing his things, and being in very close proximity to others of his close circle. And then suddenly I was alone and unstructured in terms of how I experienced, my own mourning process. And so what I began to do, I began to do a couple things without really knowing it. Of course, I knew that this trope of queer suicide anchors my biography. And so one of the things I did was to almost frantically, but very hungrily in any case, start to attempt to explore the history of queer suicide and the archives of queer suicide. And of course, for anyone who's ever attempted to do archival research on queer and trans people, you know that prior to just a couple decades ago, we were unnamed, but pretty often described using various euphemisms and asides in the archives. So finding queer and trans folks in the archive is itself a difficult kind of work that requires reading with nuance and hearing the echoes and looking for certain things that aren't said or aren't described to catch the silhouetted outline of queer folks. And of course, the same thing is true for suicide, because for so many people, a death by suicide is filled with shame, pathology, criminality, even. For surviving folks, I think a death by suicide is marked by so much shame that they prefer people not be named in that way, or people's deaths not be described in that way. Which, of course, both of those things, to find queerness in the archive, to find suicide in the archive, it's also the case that we have our modern vocabularies and understandings of what queerness even is, of what suicide even is. It's hard enough to pin down historical queerness in any case, because that is a contemporary vocabulary. And it's hard after death to pin down whether or not a suicide has actually occurred. Unless there's an explicit claiming of suicide in the form of a suicide note or what have you. This is a pretty well-documented coroner's problem. How do you identify whether or not a suicide has taken place? So the archival work in this case, which I didn't even realize I was doing, for me it was just a process of mourning, was marked by these double erasures and sort of triple erasure through the categorical difficulty of naming either of these things. But I did it nonetheless. I also wanted to track what very soon, very quickly became apparent to me as what I describe in the book as an archetype in cultural representations of queer lives. Which is to say that if you go back and read novels, poetry, watch film, or look for other kinds of cultural productions in the historical record throughout the 20th century, and in fact much earlier, queer suicide is a very common narrative trope. And in fact, in a lot of films and plays and novels, for example, first of all, where queerness appears at all, suicide is soon to follow. Suicide often is sort of expected to be a part of a queer narrative, and that's true very far back in the historical record. And then secondly, in fiction, especially when a narrative death is unexplained, but needs to be marked and then moved on from fairly quickly, queer suicide is often used to sort of mortar that brickwork. One of my, favorite's a strange word, but one of my favorite examples of this is Song for Bobby Joe, which some of you may remember from the 70s. Bobby Gentry's famous song that was then adapted into a film. The song is about a young girl singing about the suicide of a boy from her town jumping off of the Tallahatchie Bridge. When this, we never know in the song why the boy has done this. And so when the song was adapted to a feature-length film, they fill in that gap of knowledge by just adding a random story about him confessing that he slept with a man the night before. This is extremely common. It's extremely common, as if audiences of these films and books and so on expect that to be an explanation that they would find. They don't skip a beat. That to me was very interesting. Why would that be the case? And so I began to then read, and it did start to occur to me that maybe I was researching something here, but I started to go back in the history of explicitly gay scholarship. So back to the 60s and 70s, especially, when gay and lesbian researchers and sociologists began to investigate whether this mythology of queer folks being more likely to attempt suicide was actually true. They pointed out that lots and lots of psychologists and behavioralists had suggested that this was true, but no one had actually studied it. And so there's a flurry of sociological studies charting the statistics of queer suicides in the 60s and 70s and a little bit in the early 80s that show that, in fact, this is a correct assumption. But one never knows in the context of that knowledge, which direction the causality lies. The mythology of queer suicide at this point was so entrenched that queer folks too, growing up without having met another out queer person, also expected that suicide would be something we would consider more often than others. At the same time that I was doing this work, I was also attempting to habilitate my own queer life. And I wanted to find a way to celebrate and pull from the archives examples of queer joy from my own life as a way of mourning this profoundly miserable loss. And so I, pulled boxes down from my attic, and I'm a souvenir keeper, a deeply emotional souvenir keeper. And so I have boxes of things like a chewed up coffee stirrer from my first date with this or that boyfriend, or a gift of German bubbles that this or that lover brought back from a trip to Berlin. And I began pulling them down, these objects, and writing about them just little by little. And then I became aware in conversation with an editor at Fordham University Press, for whom I was doing a reader report for someone else's book, that this might actually be a book that I begin to put together. I didn't know initially how to do that. I didn't want the book to be, uh, just a sort of dry social scientific or even dry humanities-based book describing queer suicide. I also wanted it to be a book about mourning this very particular and peculiar form of loss. And I wanted it to be a book that would perform that kind of mourning because, for my own sake, almost as a kind of catharsis. And so I eventually settled on the form of a requiem mass. I'm not Catholic. I don't, I don't find spiritual or otherwise any kind of being that's recognizable to me in that form. But I have always loved Requiem Mass compositions. And so I used the format of the Requiem with the Introitus and the Agnus Dei and the Lacrimosa and so on to structure a book that is ultimately about the archetype and the history of the archetype of queer suicide. And that recovers a lot of stories of queer suicide from the very deep past, but also a book that dwells with the question of what does it mean to grieve, and what does it mean to rehabilitate some sense of queer joy and queer togetherness, even in the context of loss, which is on its own a very queer question. How do we face loss? How do we face absence? And how do we find joy in the context of loss and death and absence and violence and so on? I think I didn't sort of plan that the book would become relevant or relevant as a marker of the threat against queer and trans people in the way that that threat has resurged here in the US in the last couple months. But of course it has. And so facing the book again in this context, I guess, is a reminder at the very least that the archetype of queer suicide is a persistent one, and it is still with us as a trope. So why don't I pause there, Patty, and
Yes, thank you
ask
so
you.
much. I'm Patty Ybarra, and I teach theater and performance studies at Brown. And the way Patrick and I know each other is actually through our shared field, our shared writing on performance, actually. And it's a little spooky to be on the Zoom with you. I didn't realize when I said yes, I was like, oh, that's the exact Zoom box I looked at through all of COVID when we were talking about so much queer history and maybe grieving different things. But that's to say, uh, I'd love to moderate the discussion. I did prepare a couple of questions that maybe come out of the now. And of course, I read this book in a manuscript form before it was published. And so this week I was reading it again today. And when I read it, as Patrick alluded to, I didn't realize that when I was reading it, that when I would be reading it again today, I guess, or in the last week, that it would resonate so heavily with this moment in terms of trying to support trans lives in general, but particularly trans kids for whom gender affirming care is, of course, important for so many reasons, but one very explicit reason is for mental health and for suicide prevention. So, to my mind, as a parent of a theater kid, as a parent who has a kid who have friends who identify as queer and trans, it's a different read than it was a year ago, is I guess what I want to say about that. That being said, I have a couple of questions about how the book works and how the book was made that you alluded to, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about. And I think one is a methodological question, and one is a little bit about the theater, actually, interestingly enough. Somehow, the first time I read it, I didn't really realize it was a book about the theater and about queer spectatorship and making theater and the ways that those things work together. So I think I'm going to ask the methodological question first, which maybe comes out of the very different ways we were trained, which is that, Patrick, you were actually really trained as a performance ethnographer, and I was trained as an archival historian. And I think we all do a little bit of both, but I was wondering if you could really push into the question of archive a little bit, or maybe ephemera, and how that structured the temporal landscape of the book. And I
Mhm.
guess what I mean is grief is recursive, right? But there's something also recursive about the kind of method you are using. So I'd love to hear you talk about the archive in relationship to the ethnography or the autoethnography a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah. So thank you for that. And I'd love to talk about that. So I'll just talk in very sort of specific terms about the labor of going through archives. I mean, the sort of day to day of it. And, for this particular book, there are, of course, with a topic this specific, although in some ways it's not a very specific archive, it's an archetypal topic. But there isn't sort of an existing archive anywhere that claims to be a place where one goes if one wants to review ephemera and artifacts and other textual residue of queer suicides of the past. And that's true for most of our projects. You have to assemble together a list of places where something may be available. And then, of course, you have to figure out how to find it within whatever the collection is. And so the initial sort of broad sweep of my archival research really was going into digitized databases of many kinds to try to find what records there were of queer as an umbrella for lots of other historical terms and suicide. And depending on the archive in which you're looking, if you're looking at the one archive for LGBT history, or if you're looking at the New York Public Library, you're going to find very different sort of search results to that. But they're very much going to be sort of clustered in the last few decades. And then they begin to trail off in the 1980s. And then they disappear entirely because those words just don't appear. And so the work of doing this kind of archival project for me is a kind of ethnography or anthropological fieldwork, which is to say that to find the records that you ultimately end up including, you have to sort of spend time in situ in the various eras that these archives are representing to try to figure out basically what the code words are, what other vocabularies that are referential, but only for those who know the language, only for those who recognize it as such. Um, to also spend time trying to track down the descriptive terminology, so the specific phrases, or turns of phrase, or ways of characterizing essentially gender deviance in one way or another, to sort of find people so I talked about how there's sort of a twin archival silence, because on one hand, that's what you're doing with queer lives. The same thing is true for suicide. So, um, how do you track down records of suicide when the survivors of suicide don't want those records to be marked as such? And it turns out, and this is one of my favorite archival finds, it's something I found in the deep archive that is about archival methodologies. That is a very old question. How do you find historical records of suicide when suicide will not be named? That is a 100-year-old question, at least. One of the first, in the early history of film, in 1919, there was an explicitly gay, explicitly pro-gay, and explicitly about suicide film made in Germany called Different from the Others. And, the Third Reich was so successful in destroying archives and records that it's hard to find, but there is a restored version of the fragments that UCLA has put together. This film was funded by a man named Magnus Hirschfeld, who was very important and who I write a lot about, who started the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin during the Weimar era. There are a lot of great books and articles about him. Some things to know about him. He was one of the first medical practitioners to actually develop gender-affirming care and perform it on people, and then to provide continuing support for trans people. He traveled the world documenting queer experiences in different parts of the world. And the very first Nazi book burning was of his materials from the Institute of Sexual Research. So their first target, as is often the case, are queer and trans folks. In fact, of that, that old footage of that first book burning on March 6th, so almost exactly 92 years ago in 1933, there's, you'll often see these frames of a big bust being carried and then destroyed by those at the book burning. That was Magnus Hirschfeld. That was his bust. In any case, in that film, he, one of the main characters who ends up dying by suicide goes through the newspapers day after day to find obituaries that have a particular way of describing the person who died and a particular obscurity about describing the death itself that points to it having been a queer suicide. And so he's doing, in 1918, when the film was shot, but in the 1919 film, this character is doing exactly what I was doing in 2020, going through old newspapers, trying to find a record of that, that which will not be spoken. Then, in the same era, the same decade, the Surrealists were, Breton was just getting started with the Surrealists in Paris, and they, put out a sort of periodical, a surrealist periodical that included what they called faits divers, or miscellany, from French newspapers. And they did the same thing. They collected obituaries of suicides in the very first issue, where it was rarely clear in that brief obituary or death notice that this was actually a suicide, and yet they could still find a way to categorize them together. I write about this in the book, and they paired that with a sort of provocation, which people then contributed responses to, the provocation being, is suicide a solution? And lots of folks responded to it, including Artaud, the theater artist, and many others of that circle. So it turns out that this is a very old archival question itself, and that provided some guidance to me as I continued. I wouldn't have known that, though, I think, if I hadn't approached the archive in the way that I think my training leads me to do, which is to look for the culture of the archive as a way of finding my way towards the artifacts themselves.
Thank you. I have a second question, but I also know that there are many of you here who may have another question. So if I could, you can use your physical hand, but since so many of you have your screens off, if you use the fake Zoom hand, that's also really helpful so I can watch the order of questions, actually. So if anyone does have a question, I would just encourage you to raise your hand. And if people need a couple more minutes, I do have a second question, but I don't want to deny you the possibility of asking those questions. Not yet. Can you talk about the theater then, Patrick? I'm going to ask you to talk for a couple of minutes about the theater. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. And then I'll go to Jen. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I didn't realize I was writing a book about theater either. But by the time you get to the end, you sort of realize there's something that, there's sort of something going on here with making an argument about theater too. I think, to be honest, it was sort of an organic thing. I've never written about the theater itself in my life. I mean, as a performance studies and performance ethnographer person, I've always written about other things using the analytic of performance, or I've, written about performance art. But I've never actually written about the theater. So it was a strange experience to realize that that's what I was doing. It's largely because, especially the friend who died in 2019, but also one of my oldest queer friends, much of our lives together involved the theater. We made theater together. We were cast in shows together. The friend who died in 2019 was a theater director. It was his professional work. It was what he did. And so in mourning him, I found myself turning to theater as a place to live through my grief, and to remember him and the others as well. And one of my favorite sort of parts of the book, every time I look back at it, is near the end when I'm writing about, I don't know if any of you saw the series or read the novel that it's based on, Station 11, during the pandemic. It's a beautiful series. It's about a pandemic that kills 99% of humanity. And so it sort of moves through time to show what happens to that last 1%. And one of the things that happens when all social infrastructure falls, again, it would be very different to watch that show now, I think, is that theater is essentially what remains. And, there's no electricity, there's no film, there's no recorded music, but there's this amazing traveling theater troupe that all of these little settlements look forward to getting their annual visit from. And I learned from this one particular really beautiful scene where one of the main characters, a woman whose parents were killed in the original pandemic and now as an adult is one of the lead performers in this traveling troupe. She's playing Hamlet. And as she does the famous soliloquy when Gertrude accosts him and says, "You have to shake yourself out of it. Your father's been dead a while. Why do you have to skulk around the house? Everybody else gets over it. It's a fact of life." And he sort of lets her have it and says, I'm not just theatricalizing my grief. This is the form of my grief. I have within that which passes show. This is not in today's Gen Z language, we'd say this is not performative. In our older version of that word, we would say this is performative, not theatrical. But however we put it, it's this incredible scene, and it's interspersed with scenes of the sort of moment when society collapses and she gets word of her parents' death. And so it's a scene that sort of taught me that there's something about theater that needs the experience of grief in order to be what it is, and that there's something about grief that actually lives in theater in a way that it doesn't live elsewhere. But Patty, I didn't know I was making an argument about theater in the book. And I think people in our field who know me or know my work will be surprised to find that I've, at this point in my life, am returning to the theater and thinking about it in that way.
Thank you. So, Jen, do you want to go?
Hi, Patrick. So, your discussions of your archival work were really interesting, and I wondered if you had used or come across any visual elements in the profiles that you explored. So I did archival work looking at the medical admission records for the only Borstal, which was kind of like a young offenders institute in the UK for women. And there was always photographs of the head and shoulders and the and a full length, and within those archives I very clearly found people who were gender diverse, probably trans, and I found that extremely touching and quite difficult to work with as well, particularly where that was overlaid for criminal convictions for suicide as it was then. And I just wondered, was there any visual or photographic elements to the archives that you were looking at?
Yeah, I love that question, and there were a lot. The Lesbian Herstory Archives is one where I was able to find, in New York, where there are actual objects that I was able to find. Sorry, I don't know where you went to on my screen, so I'm trying to. Can you wave your hand or something so I can see you? I think
Patrick, can you adjust the gallery on
Oh,
your
there you
side?
are.
Yeah. Can you adjust the gallery view?
Oh, maybe that's what the problem is.
Should be
Okay.
in right-hand corner.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tony. After all these years, I'm still learning how to use Zoom. Yes, so there are all kinds of things. There are scraps of paper with notes on them. There are photographs. I found in one place a record of a suicide with a woman's name, but not much information. But there was something about, I don't remember exactly what, the way that the way that her name was sort of emphasized in its original typeset, that made me think she was somehow important. And then it was in a completely different, unrelated location that I figured out who she was. In part because I found the newsletter that she and her partner ran in North and South Carolina and Georgia, that was a sort of underground newsletter for lesbian communities and folks in the Southeast. And so there are lots of like examples like that of little fragments. Photographs, I think I didn't, I mean, I write a bit about film. I write a bit about some paintings and images of some of the people I'm writing about. Um, uh, Impressionistic, like filmic representations from the 60s and 70s. But the photographs that I do write about photographs. The photographs that I write about are my photographic artifacts of the people, the four people in my own life. And I write about them, I think I call them a kind of bardo, a sort of in-between place in the context of loss. Um, I had one other thought, but it's left me. So mostly what I was doing, in part because the records were so old, was to look at how in medical reports, in obituaries, in coroner's reports, and so on, these deaths were described. And so, by its nature, it was a sort of textual based study. I will say, for folks who can like find their way through some German, I'm not fluent in German, can't read it fluently, but I can sort of pick my way through it. Some of Magnus Hirschfeld's writing about, he wrote quite a bit about queer suicide because he counseled so many queer people. And he spent a lot of time writing closer to the end of his life about the scars of queer people who had attempted suicide. And in this one particularly beautiful part of his book, he describes how when you're meeting someone for the first time, you begin to recognize, it's sort of breathtaking to hear it put this way, but the scars of a razor against the wrist, the gun blast against a temple, he begins to describe it in that way as being a tactile and visual remainder. So I write a bit about that, but not so much the photographs of people from those other archives. I love that project that you were describing, though. It sounds amazing.
Thank you. Deborah?
Hi, Patrick. I was wondering, do you consider an element of your work to provide a prophylactic against suicide?
That's such a great question. Thank you for that. I'm going to answer it in kind of a roundabout way, which you're probably learning is how I am. So apologies. As I was finishing this manuscript, about a month before I typed the final word, a queer trans Canadian person who I think their PhD is in clinical psychology, but they're also a scholar, published, so Alexandra Beryl is the name of his book. And he published a book called Undoing Suicidism. And he describes how, he begins the book by describing how, in his words, for most of his life, he has been suicidal. He goes on to describe how in order, and he's, you know, in a loving relationship, a long-term partnership, has a job and so on, has all the outward markings of what some might think to be a happy life, but continues to be someone who is suicidal. And he describes how in order to get a do not resuscitate sort of order or badge or whatever from the Department of Health in Ontario, he had to essentially swear that he was not suicidal. So he had to lie. He uses this story to sort of branch out and essentially critique what he calls the industry of suicide prevention. All of which, in his argument, is oriented towards essentially condemning suicide in one way or another, right? Participating in some of the same moralism of whatever. And in so doing, in his argument, actually causing more suicide because it fails to sit and just sit with the fact that many feel suicidal. And so by the time he gets to the end of this book, he argues that maybe we should reframe suicidism, what he calls suicidism, by thinking about what he calls suicide futurities as a public health practice, where we openly talk about suicidal feelings without condemning them. And then he makes, you know, it's a pretty shocking book, especially if you have experienced the suicide of a loved one. But he ends up arguing, and assisted suicide for those who live with suicide should also be a medical option, overseen by medical professionals. So this book comes out a month before I'm done. It's a very hard book to read, very difficult, painful. But at its heart is this idea that in facing the suicides of those we love, and in writing about them or talking about them or mourning them or wishing they hadn't happened, we should have at the heart of that the intention to dignify the agency of those who died in that way. So I take that roundabout route to say, I hope that if there are people who read this book who live with suicidal inclinations, I hope that they will continue to live. And I would be so deeply honored if my writing or my thinking or my sharing or whatever played a role in them wanting to continue to live. Deeply honored. And I also want to dignify and respect the agency of those who experience those things. And so I don't have a resolved answer for you. I think ultimately the answer is yes. It would have been a shorter answer to say yes, but I wanted to go that longer route because that Beryl, I did end up writing about it a bit in the foreword, but it really rattled me as I was finishing the book, and I'm glad it did.
I really appreciate your longer answer. And I was wondering if you would consider that part of a larger social, maybe slow social change that's happening in counseling and even in friendship, where you go from trying to fix the person, which seems to be the natural inclination of most of us, to actually just loving and supporting the person and not trying to fix them, no matter what the issue is.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm not a clinical, I'm not a clinical provider, but I definitely hope that is true, that's a turnaround. I worry about this moment precisely for the reason that Patty named at the outset. Because gender affirming care, for example, is a form of loving suicide prevention. And so I worry about the numbers. Tony, thank you for putting the book, link to the book I mentioned in the chat. I was just about to try to find it.
Okay. Tony, do you want to, I know you might have some comments, and then Laurel?
Yeah, thank you. I can't get my
Oh,
go for it, Laurel.
Hi. I have two questions, Patrick. A comment. One, I make the comment first. My best friend's son committed suicide as a gay man, and California covered it up and said it was what you're talking about. They declared it as nothing. He just died, natural death. But she's a fiction writer, not a fiction. She's a memoir writer. She's brought him to life by writing the story of what happened to him and why he committed suicide. And I'm wondering if that's not a place to go. In other words, this is a parent, a mother, who's brought her son back to life by writing the true story and honoring his death. That's question one. Question two is, it's unclear to me whether you're saying that the suicide queer trope is still alive and well. And if so, is that what is going on in the movie, of The Real Pain, of the second child there, there's two cousins, and the second one is tried to commit suicide.
I'm not sure. I don't know that film.
Okay.
I know I'm supposed to, because it's supposed
Because you're theater, yeah.
But no, I don't know that film. But yeah, it's alive and well. It's everywhere. Even today, in this world in which teenagers have explicitly queer books to read being published all over the place, there's pretty much always a queer suicide somewhere. Whether it's a friend, whether it's an offhanded, well, I'm not going to go that way. It's always there somewhere. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's a very useful narrative trope for some reason. And it's one that readers and audiences get without having to be told. On your first point, I'm sorry about your friend's son, and it's horrible that there would be a cover-up. The cover-ups are a part of this history too. They're profound. There's also, I haven't talked about this, but there are these moments where the social significance of queer suicide has changed. One of them was in the 1980s, when people abandoned by public health institutions, people with HIV, queer folks with HIV, in that moment, queer suicide came to mean something else, because it took from the late 70s, when symptoms started emerging, to 1983, when the virus was first identified, all the way to 1996, before there was a medication that could even begin to convert HIV into a chronic illness. And those deaths, I'm sure I don't have to tell a lot of folks here, because we witnessed them, but those deaths were very painful and tragic and horrific, and there was no way to avoid them. And so suicide became a way of claiming agency in that moment. And there was a lot of writing, a lot of consternation suddenly among the very public health institutions that had abandoned queer folks, that suddenly said, oh, this is now, suicide is a tragedy. Suicide is something that needs to be stopped, which is interesting, because it was the only form of agency over their own lives that a lot of folks had access to. And then again, in the early 2010s, late, aughts, there was just a sudden sort of explosion of press about the so-called epidemic of queer suicide among queer and trans youth. And there are countless stories about the contagion of queer suicide that carry within them a sort of undercurrent of the contagion of queerness itself. The notion, which is another trope, of course, that queerness is contagious, especially to children. So in any case, historically, there are these moments where queer suicide is not just the same thing that it's always been in every other decade, but becomes something else. And sometimes it becomes something explicitly like agency. So anyway, just adding to what you were bringing. Thank you.
Yeah, so mother gave him agency that had been removed from him by California's coroner. She gave him back agency in the choice he made to commit suicide. Yeah. Yeah.
Tony, I know you've been such a gracious host. Do you want to have the final word or final comment here?
Sure. I just want to give so much love, folks. Patrick, immediately after I read this, I wrote to you. This is just one of the best books I've ever read. So thank you. Definitely in my top books ever. And even approaching this session today, I'm like, I can't even talk about it. You do a beautiful job with this book in so many ways. You're meticulous in your discussion. You're meticulous in your writing. And I have a hard time reading this book now because I don't want it to end, and I just keep going back and rereading it. And so I know I can always reread it, but I just don't want it to end. So thank you for putting this work out there. And I should mention Barill's book that you mentioned. I should mention this first. This received an IANI Book Award last year, so folks may remember that name. But to your work, the one thing I want to just mention with this work is you take these people's stories throughout the whole thing and you weave them around this beautiful broadly conceived archival work and memento work. And there are these, I read this as, it's a slow read for me, and I would imagine it was a slow process to write it because it's just beautiful. And what I love about it is that at the end of every section, even at the end of every paragraph, there's a twist that just breaks my heart, but pulls me back into the moment. And just thank you for that. And there's this, it's filled with favorite moments, but there's a scene you're writing about Chicago and you're going to Berlin and blah, blah, blah. And you're telling us this story, and, Rob, you've introduced Robin to us throughout the whole book, and you're describing the Chicago scene, and I'm with you in your diaries. And then there's this move where you frame your writing in this conversation with Robin. And it's just this twist that pulls me to the present. And it's a brilliant move. It's a brilliant piece of craft. So just thank you. That's just,
Thank you, Tony. That means
love it. Just love it.
I can't tell you how much that means to me and has meant to me. And I'll just say that what you just described, I'm sure you have experienced this too, but that is the experience of grief, of, the way that the interruption of whatever scene you're in, the interruption of the everyday. And since Berlin, which unfortunately closed last year, I will tell you that just this week, there's an undergrad student at DePaul who reached out to me and had found the book and said, I write for my student newspaper. I keep hearing about this place, Berlin. It didn't exist by the time I got here. I'm queer. I'm also from the South. Can I meet with you to talk about it and this book? And so yesterday I Zoomed with her, and we're going to Zoom again. So I'm glad that you picked up on the importance of Berlin, as well as on the interruptions that grief sort of performs on us. Thank you so much for that, Tony.
Yes. Tony, are we at time? I feel like we are at time. Thank you all so much for being here. And Patrick, I just feel honored that you allowed me to come into the space with you. The book it works recursively. It comes back. And I think more than a book that I read, it'll be a book I reread also, Tony. Like I think I will reread it. And it might be a different book every time. And that's a testament to its beauty and to its power.
Thank you. Patty, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and for engaging. I'd be happy to talk to folks in other venues over email or, whatever. Feel free to reach out. And thank you again, Tony.
Thank you you wrote this. So thank you. You wrote it. It's just stunning.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Really, really beautiful.